Imagine a long, never-ending corridor with doors on each side. Inside each room is a member of our aged care community. In many homes in present times, you will find outside the door a picture of the room occupant. I like to imagine, as is sometimes the case, the picture from being at a time in their life when they were at their prime. Then I choose to see them that way. For most people, there are seasons in our lives. A time for youth, a time to marry, a time to forge a career, travel and explore the world. The caterpillar becomes the butterfly as life transitions and we actualise our best lives. However, for many people with a disability, this aspect to life doesn't evolve and their lives become stuck in a loop, born from the burdens of their day-to-day care. Society's financial burden of that care is pitted against their right to their own lives in an ableist equation, and its lack of humanity as justified by the needs of the taxpayer, which they are precluded from being termed, regardless of status, from belonging to that sector. Our society is entering into a new age, an age of technology outside of fossil fuels that enabled our civilization and race to flourish. With that is a new age of well-being, self-reflection, and hopefully acceptance of our own humanity, and the inclusion of that for all human beings. With that in mind, there is much to consider, so please allow me to take you on a journey. There was once a man who was blind and deaf and had the use of only one arm. This man was not especially unusual, except that he lived until the age of 50. Whilst his life was pretty unremarkable by today's norm, it is simply extraordinary when we discover that this man lived 500,000 years ago. This man was the quintessential caveman, and even more remarkably, someone or some many had fed, washed, carried, and loved him for the term of his life. They weren't paid to do so, and yet it probably cost them a great deal. Only love and compassion can explain this amazing feat. Not only did he survive, but according to the scientists who found his remains in what is modern-day Spain and named him Elvis, he was a valued and equal member of his community. Today, of course, we would care for those like him, but would we really include him and others like him as valued and equal members of our communities? The struggle of human life and the human condition has followed a long journey. Humankind as we are today had many achievements along that journey, whilst attempting to survive and master that struggle. The first achievement was the emergence of us as the dominant species on Earth, which was due in no small part to our next greatest achievement, which was to become conscious beings. Since this cognitive revolution thousands of years ago, we developed language, writing, art, music, religion, governance, and science. We have had several industrial revolutions, which finally brought us to the technological revolution that is driving even more remarkably and faster occurring change. From the wheel to Wi-Fi, we have changed our world with many great achievements. But the greatest change, the greatest revolution, was our own biological and cultural evolution. Who are we as a species? What have we become? Is our last frontier facing us now? What is humanity, and what is it to be a human being? Why are we? To know and be true to ourselves and ensure the world that we now design does not limit our own survival, but honours and pays homage to the conscious, thinking, loving beings that got us to the present time. Whether one believes in intelligent design or not, it is we who will shape our future. If we fail to recognise the compassionate beings that we truly are, we lose what was the very key to our survival. If we lose sight and allow ourselves to exist in a purely material sphere, then we will lose not only the natural world that has sustained us, but the inner one that has enabled our very survival. Our current society places inhumane constraints on our humanity, preventing us from taking care of each other and our natural world, yet believing our hands are tied, that we simply can't afford to, is an artificial construct of our own design. We are bound to taking care of our young. We need nurture and feeding to survive. Whether we be the fittest, strongest, most successful, or the weakest among us. This is not the doings of the survival of the fittest paradigm. We have been fed. The failure to feed our world and nurture our weakest properly is the failure of a part of our technology information-based system, that being money. It is within our power to change that paradigm and place a higher value on our true nature as compassionate beings and include all souls who exist, excluding none. We must be careful not to allow our technology and infrastructure to prevent the survival and advancement of our species, else we shall be victims of our own success and the designers of our own demise. The 18th century philosopher Goethe illustrated the temptation of choosing the easier path, the conveniences and indulgences that cost rather than contribute. In his play, Faust, the path of choosing the greater good is often the more difficult, more arduous one. The investment in time, effort and concern, thinking and taking time to puzzle out the effects on other people and searching to reveal the better solution is to deny the quick fix or the easy path. It's much easier to take a path of willful ignorance, presuming that the choices and actions of a single individual don't contribute that much and wouldn't make that much difference anyway. We too often look, for instance, at the invention of fire, but not at the souls who huddled together as a loving family around it. We too often look at things in a moment and miss the real indicators of our success. The great anthropologist Margaret Mead once famously said, "If a fish were an anthropologist, the last thing it would discover was water." This analogy is very true. We fail to see our humanity due to being human and attempting to survive the human condition ourselves in the modern world. It is believed in popular culture that cavemen were harsh brutes, living in a survival of the fittest world. We believe that they lived in an environment that was animal in nature. We do not conceive that compassion, that love, and the belonging of family could be afforded and was ever afforded to the most vulnerable or disabled in that period of time so long ago. We consider compassion to be a modern virtue and purely a byproduct of our modern society, that we evolved to it and not from or because of it, when in fact this kind of compassion has been most absent in the modern age until our most recent time period. In the modern age, it took 2 world wars and an industrial and a scientific revolution before human rights and societal compassion for all came into being. Yet, many archaeological sites across the world and across time debunk the myth that our caveman ancestors were merely brutes and paints a picture instead of compassion, love, and with the eternal, even immortal, and even the vital bonds of family. In fact, it paints a picture that compassion and human connection is what greatly contributed and was even essential to our evolution and survival. It is what defines us and set us apart from other species. It is a reason for our success, and not that the fittest survived at all costs. Yet, this philosophy of the survival of the fittest has justified the nature of capitalism, social policy, business behaviour, and the human condition itself in our modern age, when the reality is that the key to our survival is quite the opposite. Compassion was, and still is, our biological advantage. Yet how profoundly this survival of the fittest view has adversely affected those in our society who are deemed not to be the fittest, evolving us to a society that is shaped and dictated to by what can be afforded when money, ironically, is our own construct. Life grew more and more complex as our civilization structures and our societies did. As life became more complex in a material world, we soon were able to put a price on how much a human life cost, rather than what it means to us. Have we considered what it would cost to lose that person who, we show by the behaviour within our current society, contributes nothing and therefore is of no value? In more ancient times, this greatly affected our benevolent benefactors, be them church or state, and this was the reason why so many were put to death, discarded in poorhouses, or languished in institutions. The group recognised a material cost, rather than a life of emotional importance. The larger the group, the greater the disconnection, and the easier it is to devalue human life. We cannot have full social inclusion if we believe that some have no worth or practical use, and we fail to realise their value emotionally. We created people statistics, which is a far more deadly label than any other. This became the ultimate dehumanisation. Materialism has come at a great cost to humankind. Inflation has exploded, and our longer lives are spent working for most of that life. Many will never own a home. Many will live twice as long as our ancestors and work for twice or even quadruple as long as those ancestors lived, with equality and women working alongside men, bringing in a double income. A family unit works for as much as a single breadwinner did just a generation ago. The fittest among us became the tax-paying contributors, and our wealthiest became valued above the mass population. Money became the indicator of fitness. Ironic when we consider that the modern financial system is a slowly but surely failing system. Yet, it has profoundly shaped our values and our lives. We as a global society believe in a somewhat Machiavellian way that the end justifies the means. This is the very meaning of survival of the fittest, that it is acceptable for some to perish if it means the survival of others, who are obviously more entitled and superior. That the overarching belief of survival of the fittest is for the ultimate protection of our species, the fittest in our modern world amounting to those that are the least financial burden and the best tax contributors. We might no longer have a public eugenics model, but with worth being pinned to material worth, we don't need to. As a race, we grew from a small group or family to a world culture in a phenomenally short space of time. It is time we saw that global group as our family and not as separate from ourselves. Though on the face of the planet, we seemed so divided, astronauts, observing us from the stars, see the Earth as one tribe of people and experience an overwhelming feeling that they call the overview effect. This is a psychological phenomenon of global unity that was noted in ancient times in many religions from people who did not need the millennia of technology afforded to them to see the Earth in space. It is called samadhi in the East, a state of clarity and unity. We saw it and felt it in our caves, and we are beginning to see it as a greater global community. That connection we seek and feel most in our families is connection, and that connection with one another in family, in tribe, in culture, and community. It is our reason for being and what defines us at our very core. From spirituality to psychology and quantum physics, our modern society is discovering what we knew all along, what our prehistoric man elders knew, as did his family. We are all connected, from around a fire as a family group hundreds of thousands of years ago, to looking out from a space station window at our planet today. We are still one tribe. This is the only constant of our species, our connection as social beings. All living organisms demonstrate compassion, from the most complex, like ourselves, to the least on the scale of a single-cell organism, such as an amoeba. We have developed mirror neurons to such a level that we can literally feel another's pain. Our compassionate caveman ancestors knew that without the family group, the tribe would not survive. That is something that every living cell knows and is the only thing that perpetuates our species, giving us a purpose. Our caveman Elvis, as useless as our modern society would say he was to a so-called survival of the fittest group, was in fact essential to his group. Consider that such a person had essential knowledge or intelligence that the group would have perished without. We believe that wars, famine, and all of our struggles are worthwhile and even necessary because we are working to a brighter future. That society, like our biology, is magically evolving, and without our participation, we miraculously find its way. We make the world what it is. With our thoughts, we create the world. The Buddha. This was most prevalent after the Second World War. People died in huge numbers. Terrible atrocities had occurred, and people in return for governance now demanded change. Placated, we will endure anything that befalls us. But if that veneer of trust is broken and we do not feel safe, the trappings of civilization quickly become invisible, and we are capable of great change as a necessity. Throughout history, it has often been a small group of individuals who from the bottom made great changes. After the Second World War, many wanted that change, and finally it was the people en masse, regardless of status, who were beginning to have a voice. But Einstein said he didn't know how the Third World War would be fought, but the Fourth would be fought with sticks and stones. Who would we be if stripped of all our trappings of technology, science, and religion? We can equate it to the supposition of what would happen in a post-apocalyptic world. Who would we be? What makes us any different to our caveman ancestors? Have we actually evolved at all? In disaster, would we work together, as we have for hundreds of thousands of years? Are we as evolved as our modern society would have us believe? Or are we in fact more human if freed from the constraints of modern society? Is it in reality our modern society that is primitive and outdated? The two great wars in this past century created such an enormous number of disabled people that the greater population had to accept that they existed and had to provide for them. The burden on the governmental system bore great fruit in the implementation of a societal model of care. Under this system, the true leper of all time, the poor, could finally be accommodated. Poverty is the greatest social disability of all time, and one that the disabled are too often also carrying as a further burden. 500,000 years ago, Elvis was cared for simply because he mattered. Yet only in the last 70 years have we developed human rights laws and medical care. And it was only in 1986 that the huge institutions in this country that housed the unwanted were closed. The baby boom that occurred, especially after the Second World War, precipitated the need for hospital care, social welfare for disabled, for single mothers and the unemployed. Finally, medical care, paid for by the government and the National Health Service in 1948 in the United Kingdom, and Medicare in 1975 in Australia, kept more of our poorest alive. From languishing in religious institutions, finally they were handed over to the state. But all this social welfare, the medical system, schools and education came at a price. It's a price that governments across the world must bear. The welfare state was born. Single mothers, the unemployed, the disabled, the sick and the wounded could be cared for. So, taxation rose, costs rose, and for a while, so did our standard of living. The conflict between caring for our loved ones and not being able to afford to do so rose. Human rights sought to balance that conflict. After the Second World War, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was born. This was the first international declaration of human rights. It was not until 1975 that we had the Declaration of Rights for Disabled Persons. It would be the 1980s before people with disabilities would be encouraged to live in the community, and the worst of the institutions would finally close their doors, some 400 years after they began. It was the parents of disabled children who first marched for their care after the war. In the 1970s, it was those children who marched. The advent of the American Disability Act was brought in by young people who literally got out of their wheelchairs and crawled up the steps of the town hall in protest. Here in Australia, it was 1986 before we had a Disability Rights Act, and 2013 before we implemented the NDIS. Remember, Elvis lived 500,000 years ago? Sadly, the barriers that face those with disability today in Australia is the fact that going out into the community is seen as a great idea, just and right, but our economy has costed a whole range of people out of that equation. Housing is not affordable for many, double-income families, let alone one person on a pension and coping with a disability. Tragically, children with disabilities now outlive their parents. Some parents have been so afraid of what will happen to their children that they have killed themselves along with their children. Many in the community have perished as a result of poor care, or they live lonely, desperate lives, dependent on inconsistent and low quality of care. Families may vary in dynamics, and we will always seek out others of like mind, whom we'll call our family. It does not matter if they are disabled or a different colour or religion. That need to belong and to connect has transcended hundreds of thousands of years. It has been bigger than Christ, Muhammad, and Buddha, more prevalent than any plague, withstood every war and toppled governments. Everything that history could throw at it has been thrown, yet it remains. Family, connection, community is more powerful than time itself. That connection and compassion was the key to our caveman's survival and remains the key to ours. That primary need for connection, love, compassion, family is what has sustained us throughout all time. And the astronaut in the space station watches from above, perhaps looking on a photo of his family. Below him, light up across the globe, millions of warm lights in all the homes and cities across the world, all clustered together in groups, every light being a home to a family, our core, our guiding light, and our being, connection. We seek it, we covet it, and we protect it at all costs. We believe our humanity is what makes us human. It defines us. Connection through family and compassion is how we express that humanity through others. And looking back across time and back to our caveman in Spain, we are faced with the same issues that we always have. Though we think of ourselves with such pride for what we have accomplished, we are still powerless to solve the same issues. We live in a world that is more connected than it ever has been, but we are disconnected from each other. Poverty remains. People still go to bed hungry and without sufficient medical care. Wars still rage around the world. Disease still claims millions of lives. The bubonic plague and leprosy still exist in the world. With the modern plague COVID-19, we found ourselves quarantining people in their homes, much the same as we did a century ago with a virulent strain of influenza and early with the Great Plague. The human condition still very much exists. Man's inhumanity to man exists throughout all of time. However, our barbarianism today should be judged far more harshly than 500,000 years ago. That is because today language, knowledge, and civilization exist. Nonetheless, the realities of that prehistoric world are still not too different from our own. Star Wars was first launched at the same time that the French guillotine was still in use. People are still executed by beheading publicly, and there are still 27 million slaves in the world today. Some 150 countries still use torture, and we still have child soldiers. 1 in 5 people in the world are malnourished. Against our amazing progress, we still haven't solved the basics, and that is how to make our great progress affordable and available to all. We can put a man on the moon, but we haven't solved poverty. In fact, we created the system that created poverty. So it is not surprising that there are many people with disabilities who are neglected. We may not be tossing them in the Tiber River, but they are yet to be cared for to achieve equality in society and live a fulfilling life. So why do we judge how we look after the disabled in our community by the care, time allocated that they receive, and not by the quality of their life and inclusion in our community? We must ask ourselves, is it because we don't think their life is worth anything, don't see them as equal? With all our progress in the last century, one would think that those with a disability would not only be well cared for, but living a successful life in the community. So let's look at a modern story of a man not dissimilar to our prehistoric man. Some people have tried to work in the aged care sector, yet not fared well in the nursing homes. The rushing to shower people and shave them and get them dressed in under 10 minutes. No time to be gentle, no time to talk, limited compassion, no connection. Like operating on a sheep farm or in cattle yards, rooms instead of pens, but filled with miserable people waiting to be processed. The same overwhelming smell of excrement and urine. Have we institutionalised our elderly? Institutions provided bulk care to large groups to maintain their existence. The houseplant model of care. Days revolved around care and keeping them alive. Carers were bum wipers and not expected to do anything else, let alone provide compassion and connection with our elders, who were alone, lonely and frightened, and just waiting for God. No concept that they had contributed to society and community, were still alive, and had life left to live. Little changes in the experience of caring for the disabled. A lot of time driving from one job to another with rarely enough work to provide a living wage, and always extremely variable, ever-increasing responsibility, less and less money, and no more humane than the aged care sector. Just clocking in and clocking out. But is anyone clocking in behind the one clocking off? The business model seems to be to hire as much fodder as possible and keep it rotating to avoid the cost of nurturing staff and keep the government employment grants constant. An exploitative and non-productive financial model. Highlighting this scenario is a call for a carer to attend to a man we will call Tony, who had no one to get him out of bed. It wasn't the greatest start because, well, I needed to arrive before I'd left the previous job. This is the story of how that interaction between Tony and myself ensured. Tony Hapley was to be found in his bed, a hospital bed with the sides up and thick padding. The bed was covered in vomit and excrement. Tony was a 61-year-old man in a white t-shirt covered in food and the biggest movie star quality smile you ever saw. I was taken aback. Here I was, late, and he has a smile for me. I said hello, and that I had no idea what I was doing. He smiled again and said, "I'll teach you." We became a team for nearly 5 years and had many adventures. His place was filthy. All the inner doors had massive holes in them. No food or drink in the fridge. This man couldn't use a phone and had no real use of his hands, but only had 4 hours of care a day. He was helped to get up, toileted, washed and dressed and placed in front of the TV with a DVD from the library. He had no breakfast, no lunch, no company, and no one until tea shift. Meals on wheels, shoved down him, then bed. His minimal level of care, just enough to survive, was maintained with no thought to the quality of his life and that this was a human being with human needs. Tony had spent 15 years sitting in front of the same documentaries over and over again. In modern zoos, we provide enclosures to promote the emotional well-being of animals and ensure that they have stimulation and company. It is staggering that essential care for human beings fails to do the same. Tony had suffered third-degree burns when one carer placed him in a hot bath, and subsequently he spent 3 weeks in ICU. He had had his bladder burst by another carer who decided to flush his catheter with tap water. He had endured a broken leg from being dropped by another carer, which was only discovered when his father came around and found him in the bath with the carer's naked girlfriend and some essential oils. He had severe hemorrhoids and bled every day. He had teeth that had been removed by being snapped off at the gum. He had an extremely painful testicular cyst the size of a grapefruit. Yet, he still managed to smile. I was able to secure him 24-hour care 7 days a week. He had had a long succession of carers, many of whom had paid lip service, but who left him when the going got tough, as inevitably it would. We went on trips to the Minister of Health, gate crashing at breakfast with the Prime Minister, but finally, with considerable campaigning, he got his care. No longer being left alone at night cold, no being hungry, bored and thirsty. We went to beaches, we took his dad out most Sundays, we went out everywhere we could think of. He and I got stuck in lifts, bogged on beaches, and shut in a zoo when we couldn't get out through the gate. So there we were, 7:30 p.m, getting dark, watching the city lights with the yellow-tailed bandicoot. He was thrilled. This was an adventure. We were out. The bandicoots may have been slightly concerned, but we knew we'd work it. Just shy of 5 years later, and it is now the final weeks of his life. I've taken Tony out of hospital. He had been cardioverted twice. The hospital had neglected to give him his medications after renal colic, and his heart blew out. In fact, they had neglected to even tell us that he even had a kidney stone. His life was apparently worth so little. The pain of a kidney stone was acceptable to them. I had had the same argument I usually had, which was whether his life was worth living and would I change his advance care directive. He was dying, and it was time to honour his wishes and take him home. I said to my RN, "Have him ready, I'm taking him." Tony talked to very few people around him because after years of silence, he was comfortable. I'd whisper in his ear, "Go to California," and he knew I was going for a while, and he'd vague out. Back in his chair, which he named Bucephalus, after Alexander the Great's mighty steed, he was much more himself. I had the oxygen supplier there waiting at his home, and we got everything ready. Such a long journey we had had. A promise was about to be fulfilled. I had stayed with him until the very end. That last week, we got as much life as we could. He was prescribed medical marijuana, which he enjoyed, and watched movies and sometimes just the fish tank on YouTube. He chatted during the day and he chatted at night. I was able to give him hour-long showers in the warm water. We played music, sang, cried, and sometimes we just were. With a disco ball hanging from the ceiling that we had salvaged from an outing to Victor Harbour, and surrounded by fairy lights and music, he lived his last days. The rhythm of his life was our routine. If he was awake, we chatted and allowed him to take advantage of every second, just as we had done in the years before. We gave him his autonomy as a human being. His life officially ended 12th of April, 1:26 a.m. He had only been actively dying for 12 hours. He wasn't going to waste life dying, I suppose. I was next to him and the sound of music played. I was singing, "What are we going to do about Maria?" And then he just left. He was in no pain, and he was warm and safe and cared for. He did not have to fear strangers attending to him. He didn't have to fear people not turning up or not knowing what he needed. He had his team, and he was in total control of his environment. Rather than dying to someone else's schedule and convenience, Tony had psychological issues from the years of poor care, and his condition affected his memory. he would panic and get out of sorts. So we would call him back with a familiar phrase. You are safe. You are being cared for. You are loved. The door is locked. Coda the dog is under your bed. You are at home, and I am here, and I will not be leaving you alone. I performed CPR until the paramedics arrived, and then they took over, and he was pronounced dead. Alison, the nurse, and I stayed with him that night, as promised. We didn't leave him alone. The next morning, when we stood around the gurney, we just said spontaneously as a team, you are safe. You are cared for. You are loved. You will never be alone. How many hundreds of times had we said it to comfort his mind and his soul? He was a Hare Krishna devotee, and we bathed him in Ganges water, washed him with sandalwood and turmeric, and wrapped him in sacred cloth. What compelled me to do all of this? I'm slightly embarrassed to say that it was not just my compassion for him. It was his for me. That is something I feel that I can never repay. It is the most humbling thing. I was able-bodied, had healthy children, and my whole life ahead of me. Yet I saw only his barriers. He could have been angry, and perhaps should have, given his situation, yet he chose to show me compassion. As Hugh Mackay said, no one can promise you that a life lived for others will bring you a deep sense of satisfaction, but it is certain that nothing else will. I tell people that there are two types of people who do this job: the good, who become humbled, and the weak, who seek it out for empowerment. He was severely disabled, but still an intelligent man, 20 years my senior. It was an odd friendship, a companionship. He was our boss and our mentor. He suffered my impatience and excitability, as he called it, and exercised great compassion in teaching me what must have been so obvious to him. He endured my singing as I enthusiastically sang the Bhagavad Gita to him in Sanskrit, until 6 months later he begged a hiatus. The only thing he had difficulty enduring was our absence and ABBA. Assuming that in the 21st century, the lives of those with a disability were good in all cases, as assuming the same for our elderly proves incorrect. Many of us become so desensitized by a cruel existence that we fail to feel the moral outrage we should for those who suffer needlessly. Many languish at home, are so very lonely, and they are the lucky ones to have a home. We live in such a clinical world in which care is a policy or a plan, and no longer a sentiment or an action of compassion. Professional boundaries are misunderstood, and as an overarching policy in our healthcare system, it is a system that denies us our own humanity, causing great distress for both patient and provider, and yet far too often fails to protect the client anyway. It changes the job to a role and changes the type of people drawn to it. The experience of and with Tony is the experience of far too many in our world. Compassionate care should always be a part of all care for the sake of those being cared for and the carer's well-being. I am moved to remember the death of Tony's father, a recipient of the Order of Australia, in a nursing home. He died alone. We visited him as often as we could. Tony, unable to touch his father, would ask me, please stroke his head and kiss him and tell him for me that I love him. Next to the dying man's bed was a care plan. It read, check on him 4 hourly, say kind things, and swab his mouth. I remember thinking how 4 hours must seem like an eternity dying alone. 1 in 6 hospitals in Australia has a palliative care unit. Yet, statistically, we all die. Sadly, the tribe of the dead have yet to rise and complain. How someone else dies determines the regard for life by the living. Simple pleasures, like having a lie-in, is a rare event when you are disabled, as you must live your life according to the schedule of your carers. Staying up to watch a movie or for an event has to be planned long term. Many have to be have an enema every morning, so they go to the toilet when the carers are there to fit with the carer's schedule. Much of their lives revolve not around their ability, but our inability to care for them. Missed shifts means people get left in bed until the next shift, which could be dinner time, or that lunch is missed. Bedtime is determined by a roster, not by choice. It's hard to speak of change and choice when we expect people to open their bowels when it's convenient for others. Lives are managed around rosters that preoccupy that person's world. Care can't be taken for granted and becomes an obsession and a burden of worry for the individual. New experiences and achieving new things, doing new things, and having anything extra in life is an uncertain, typically not realised luxury. Life's most basic needs become a privilege, and an uncertain one at that. People's lives are budgeted out in rosters, which determine not whether they have a good quality of life, but a basic standard of care. We need to change the shape of care and judge our standards not by a ticker box list to satisfy a budget, but by the outcomes of care. Did they achieve the best quality of life? Did they achieve their best life? What was obvious to anyone at the time was the horrific conditions that Tony had managed to survive in. Yet appalling as it is, no one was interested in helping him. And terrifyingly, this is a too common experience. Yet it wasn't the conditions or his disability that he was enduring. It was loneliness, a loss of trust in the world, delivered and compounded by a lack of compassion. Above all else, that was what he craved the most. Prior to me taking charge and arranging his 24/7 care, he had no guarantee who would turn up, or even when or if they would turn up to give him his care. His sole focus was on his most basic need to survive. He spent many nights alone in bed, cold all night, with no one to put a blanket on him, or laying there all night in his own excrement or vomit, cold and waiting for someone to decide to turn up, or thirsty on a sweltering hot day, stuck in his chair in front of the TV, unable to get himself water, listening to the phone ring as the Red Cross called the vulnerable persons list, and him unable to answer the phone anyway. The thought of spending the day at the beach and watching a sunset were not even in his mind. Our caveman, Elvis, judging by his longevity, could at least take for granted that he was going to be cared for and have his basic needs met. The cognitive dissonance that these kinds of stories generate is a horrible, hostile defense. People like the safety of their own realities and don't like to have that reality challenged. In a less complicated world, like the one inhabited by our caveman, Elvis, it was perhaps simpler. But in a modern society, everything must be justified, and the justifications must fit the criteria of a material perspective. Why should we take care of the less fortunate? It's what makes us human. We like to look at kittens on the internet. We like to see animals saving each other and acts of human kindness. This triggers our vagus nerve, and we feel good. Each and every one of us guide the future of humanity. It is everyone's responsibility. If for no other reason, then at least there but for the grace of God go I. Compassion, if not interfered with, has been hardwired into our very biology. It has been present since we first existed. The modern interpretation of the survival of the fittest paradigm simply isn't true. It isn't true that all people with disabilities or people who were vulnerable were killed off by our ancestors. None of that was true then, and it isn't true now. Just as Humphrey Bogart never said, "Play it again, Sam," Charles Darwin never coined the phrase, "survival of the fittest." In fact, he called compassion the almost ever-present instinct. He said, those communities which included the greatest number of the most sympathetic members would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring. What is true is that we are a caretaking species. We find purpose in doing so. In so doing, we have created a cooperative that has worked together. We know that in giving compassion, we give an anti-inflammatory that boosts our immune system. We know that it was the key to our very survival as a species and is connected to our very biology. Our survival does not depend on the fittest. It depends on the kindest. We didn't survive because of discoveries like fire, but because we were driven not just by our own survival, but by the survival of our group, our family. So was our friend Tony an anomaly? Sadly, not so. In Australia alone, we have many with issues too complex, with no answers for them in our society. They spend years in hospital or in nursing homes with nowhere to go. These people are our sons, our daughters, our fathers and mothers, and we owe them the same care and compassion that our prehistoric caveman was afforded 500,000 years ago. To live as long a life as possible as a cherished, valued, equal member of the group. No cost justifies the exclusion of anyone. It cannot be a question of, well, anything over this amount and that life is less worthy. It isn't enough to just tend to people like a houseplant. In 50 years of life, our prehistoric man's group would have endured many challenges and the risks would have been higher, and yet he survived. In our highly developed modern world full of human rights, we have barely progressed beyond prehistoric values, and we have failed to even meet those values. Yet here we can cite prehistoric values as a better example of humanity. Once we abandon the survival of the fittest dogma, we are free to be masters of ourselves, no longer bound by the myth of scarcity that is reflected within our societal and monetary systems. How we measure ourselves and our successes should no longer be based on survival, but on how we are evolving and thriving. Psychologically, we are then free to reach our true potential, which is self-actualization and ultimately global transcendence. Then we are no longer bound by the constraints of the human condition, and our existence is more than just our mere survival of that existence. What a different world we would live in. The person with the disability should be able to take for granted that they will receive the necessary care that they require so that they may be free from that basic need and move forward in their life towards their best, self-actualized life. Then perhaps we will have evolved beyond the standard of care that our prehistoric man so evidently enjoyed. We must provide sanctuary and empowerment to those who need empowerment so that they are able to obtain self-actualization and live their best lives. In modern times, there is no need to create artificial barriers to inclusion of all when all the barriers are artificial and of our own design. If we chose, we could feed, clothe and house everyone on this planet now, the same way that we could provide better care and perhaps more importantly, better lives for those who need it. As the closure of institutions has proved, the attitude towards care that prevailed at the time did not facilitate the great change as anticipated. Bricks and mortar change nothing. Hearts and minds do. Let's look to the person and not the building or the policy, and let their quality of life be the testimony and the standard we measure. For that standard, in turn, is the measure and litmus test of our own humanity. Let us embrace compassion at the forefront of all we do. Let us abandon the myth of survival of the fittest to justify our ills and our modern world once and for all. Our survival has depended and will always depend on the cooperation and connection of all human beings. Our compassion should be the only currency that we are bound to. Let's shape our standards not by the quality of the day-to-day care, which should be a given, but by the quality of the life lived. In the 500,000 years since our prehistoric man, Elvis, died, it should be a given now that those in need receive the care they need and are thus able to strive beyond, to aspire and to live their best life. The focus should therefore be the actualization of that individual's best life, free from the burden and worry of day-to-day care, and that should be the measure of the quality of care given. We have achieved much in the last century. With our human rights and the right to life, it is a natural progression that this should evolve to a right to truly live. Sadly, as a general quality of care for too many is sporadic or not afforded to all, it is time to strive towards a new modern reality that honours our ancient compassionate past and ensures a humane and compassionate world for the future. With compassion as our currency, brings to the forefront the golden rule, which is to treat others as we would wish to be treated ourselves. If we change how we measure outcomes in care, we solve the poor care and poor attitudes that are endemic in our healthcare system and in society. Simply put, we empower the autonomy of the individual and respect not only their right to life, but also their right to live their best life their way. 500,000 years ago, before human rights and the rule of law and social care, a disabled man was a valued and equal member of a community. Until that is a given for every Elvis in our modern developed world, it is we who are the brutes. As Benjamin Franklin said, justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. For if the most vulnerable among us have their best life, will we all not then be entitled to live our best lives also? We must learn to see the global community as our tribe, just as the astronauts looking down from space do when they experience the overview effect of global unity. We can then embrace what our ancestors knew. A better life for a stranger equates to a better world and a better life for you. Connection is not only our key to survival, but what defines us as human. We must be the change we wish to see, and we must embrace the world as our tribe and family, for then we will be as outraged as those who are affected, because they are then our kin. Just like Elvis, a valued member of the community. He was safe, he was cared for, he was loved, and he was never alone. Makes you high. Sunshine makes you high. That wasn't sunshine.